The funeral director was still adjusting the flowers when my daughter-in-law leaned close to my ear and whispered the words that would haunt me for months. "You have 1 week to pack your things and get out." I sat there in the front pew, clutching the memorial program for my son Albert, my hands trembling, not from grief alone, but from the shock of what I'd just heard. The scent of lilies filled the air, and Pastor Williams was speaking about eternal peace and God's plan. But all I could focus on was the woman beside me in her perfectly pressed black dress, dabbing at dry eyes with a tissue while planning my exile. Albert was gone, my only child, my 34-year-old son, who'd called me every Sunday without fail, had suffered a massive heart attack while jogging through our neighborhood in suburban Chicago. One moment he was training for his first marathon. The next, he was lying on the pavement while strangers performed CPR until the paramedics arrived. The doctors said it was a rare genetic condition, something that could strike anyone, anytime, without warning. 3 days later, I was sitting in Riverside Memorial Chapel, listening to his wife Mia tell me I had 7 days to disappear from the only home I'd known for the past 8 years. Mia squeezed my shoulder after delivering her ultimatum, a gesture so gentle and caring that anyone watching would have thought she was comforting her grieving mother-in-law. But I knew better now. I'd been living under the same roof as this woman since 2016, when Albert and I had pooled our resources to buy the 3-bedroom house on Maple Street. After my husband died and Albert lost his job at the marketing firm, we decided that combining our finances made sense. I contributed $45,000 from the sale of my downtown condo toward the down payment, and my name went right there on the deed alongside his. It wasn't charity or a temporary arrangement. It was a partnership, a family investment in our shared future. But Mia had always seen it differently. From the moment she married Albert 2 years ago, she'd made subtle comments about when we have our own space and how 3 people in one house can be challenging for newlyweds. She never said it directly, never demanded I leave, but the message was clear in every eye roll when I forgot to rinse my coffee cup, every sigh when I watched my evening news programs, every suggestion that maybe I'd be happier in one of those nice senior communities closer to downtown. Albert, bless his heart, had always deflected her hints with humor or changed the subject entirely. "Mom's not going anywhere," he'd say, wrapping an arm around my shoulders. "This is her house too. Besides, who else is going to make sure I eat actual vegetables instead of living on pizza and energy drinks?" But I could see the tension it created between them, the way Mia's smile would tighten whenever he defended our arrangement, the way she'd go quiet during family dinners when Albert and I would reminisce about his childhood or discuss house repairs. Now, sitting in that funeral home pew with my son's body lying just 15 feet away in a mahogany casket we'd chosen together 3 days earlier, Mia wasn't being subtle anymore. She wasn't hinting or suggesting or making passive-aggressive comments about space and privacy. She was giving me a direct order, as if Albert's death had somehow transferred complete ownership of our shared home to her alone. I didn't respond to her whispered threat during the service. I couldn't. My throat felt like it was closing, and my mind was reeling between grief for Albert and disbelief at Mia's audacity. Instead, I sat frozen, watching as she stood to greet late arrivals, playing the role of the devastated young widow with Oscar-worthy precision. People kept approaching her with condolences, telling her how strong she was being, how sorry they were for her loss. Several elderly women from my church patted her hand and said things like, "You're so young to be going through this," and I can't imagine losing a husband at your age. Each comment felt like a knife twist. Not because I begrudged Mia her grief losing a spouse is devastating at any age, but because everyone seemed to forget that I'd lost something irreplaceable too. Albert wasn't just her husband. He was my child, the baby I'd rocked through countless sleepless nights, the little boy who'd brought me dandelions and called them flowers, the teenager who'd held my hand at his father's funeral, the man who'd become my closest friend and confidant. When the service ended and people began filing toward the reception hall, Mia made a show of helping her grandmother to the car while leaving me to walk alone. I rode with her in Albert's silver Honda Accord, breathing in the lingering scent of his cologne and fighting back tears while she drove in complete silence. The radio was tuned to a classical station, something Mia preferred but Albert had always tolerated, and I found myself wondering how many other small changes she'd already begun implementing in his absence. At the house, she transformed into the gracious hostess, directing the flow of casserole dishes and flower arrangements, accepting embraces from neighbors and co-workers, sharing carefully chosen memories of Albert's kindness and humor. I stood in the corner of our living room, my living room, watching her perform for an audience that had no idea what she'd whispered to me just hours earlier. She talked about Albert's dreams for their future, their plans to travel, and maybe start a family, how much he'd loved bringing people together in their home, not our home, not the house that Albert and I had chosen together, where I'd painted the guest bathroom pale yellow because it reminded me of sunshine, where I'd planted the herb garden that Albert loved to raid for his weekend cooking experiments. In Mia's version of events, I was already erased, already gone, as if I'd never contributed a single dollar or lived a single day under this roof. But I noticed other things too, small details that made my chest tighten with something beyond grief. The family photo that usually sat on the hallway table, the one of Albert, Mia, and me from last Christmas had vanished. Albert's favorite reading chair, the oversized recliner where he'd spent countless evenings with his books and crossword puzzles, had been pushed into a corner and covered with a throw blanket like it was something to hide. His coffee mug, the one with the faded Chicago Cubs logo that he'd used every morning for 3 years, was nowhere to be seen. Mia was already erasing him, editing our shared life to fit whatever narrative she'd constructed in her mind. And if she was willing to eliminate traces of her own husband barely 72 hours after his death, what chance did I have of remaining in the story she was rewriting as the last visitors left and Mia began clearing wine glasses and paper plates with mechanical efficiency? I retreated to my bedroom, the room I'd called home for 8 years, where I'd hung my mother's watercolor paintings and arranged my collection of mystery novels on the built-in shelves that Albert had installed for my 65th birthday. But something felt different the moment I stepped inside. The room looked exactly as I'd left it that morning when we'd gone to the funeral home. But there was an unsettling quality to its sameness, like a stage set that had been carefully preserved. My jewelry box sat in its usual spot on the dresser, but I could have sworn it had been moved slightly to the left. The throw pillows on my reading chair were arranged differently than I remembered. Small things, subtle changes that could have been my imagination or the result of Mia tidying up for company. But when I opened my closet, my suspicions were confirmed. 3 cardboard boxes sat on the floor, each one labeled in Mia's neat handwriting, Layla's winter clothes, Layla's books, Layla's personal items. She'd already begun packing my life away, sorting through my belongings like I was already gone, like my departure was such a foregone conclusion that she could start boxing up my existence before I'd even agreed to leave. I stood there staring at those boxes, my heart pounding with a mixture of rage and disbelief. This wasn't grief. This wasn't a young widow struggling to cope with loss. This was calculated, deliberate, and cruel. Mia was using my son's death as an opportunity to claim complete control over the home we'd built together. And she was doing it before Albert was even cold in the ground. But I wasn't the helpless old woman she thought I was, and I wasn't going anywhere without a fight. The next morning arrived with the kind of oppressive silence that follows a storm. I woke before dawn. My internal clock still programmed for the early shifts I'd worked as a nurse for 35 years. But the house felt different, charged with an energy that made my skin crawl. The familiar sounds were all wrong. No coffee brewing in the kitchen. No morning news drifting down the hallway. No gentle clattering of Albert making his breakfast before heading to work. Instead, there was just the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of Mia's shower running behind her closed bedroom door. I padded to the kitchen in my slippers, muscle memory guiding me through the routine I'd followed for 8 years. But when I opened the cabinet where I kept my favorite ceramic mug, the one Albert had given me for Mother's Day, with "World's Best Mom," painted in fading blue letters, it was gone. In its place sat a set of pristine white mugs that I'd never seen before, arranged with military precision like soldiers awaiting inspection. My heart began to race as I opened another cabinet, then another. My mismatched collection of plates, accumulated over decades of life and marked with tiny chips and scratches that told stories, had been replaced by a complete set of modern dinnerware in cool gray. The coffee canister where I kept my preferred medium roast had vanished, substituted with an expensive-looking bag of organic dark roast that Albert had always said was too bitter. "Good morning, Layla." Mia's voice floated across the kitchen like honey poured over glass. She emerged from the hallway wearing a black silk robe, her blonde hair perfectly arranged despite the early hour. "I hope you slept well. I know yesterday was difficult for all of us." I turned to face her, still holding one of the foreign white mugs. "Where are my dishes?" She tilted her head with practiced concern, the same expression she used when explaining to elderly patients why their insurance wouldn't cover certain procedures. She worked as a billing coordinator at a medical clinic, a job that had apparently taught her to deliver bad news with a sympathetic smile. "Oh, those old things, I packed them away for you. I thought it might be easier to have everything matching while we transition." A transition. The word hung in the air like smoke, pleasant sounding but ultimately toxic. I set the mug down carefully, fighting the urge to throw it against the wall, just to hear something break in this increasingly sterile environment. "I didn't ask you to pack my things." "I know, and I'm sorry if I overstepped." Her voice carried just the right note of regret, but her eyes remained calculating. "I was cleaning yesterday after everyone left, and I got a bit carried away. Grief makes us all do strange things, doesn't it? I just thought, well, Albert always said how much he admired your strength. He'd want us to take care of each other during this time." The manipulation was masterful. I had to admit, she'd wrapped her territorial behavior in concern for my well-being and reverence for Albert's memory, making any objection seem petty or ungrateful. But I'd been a nurse long enough to recognize emotional manipulation when I saw it, had watched families tear each other apart in hospital waiting rooms while speaking in the same careful, considerate tones. "Where are they?" I asked quietly. "The dishes in the garage, in clearly labeled boxes. I can help you get them out whenever you're ready." She paused, letting the implication settle. Whenever I was ready to admit defeat and leave, coffee. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. As she moved around the kitchen with fluid efficiency, I noticed other changes. The hand towels I'd embroidered with tiny sunflowers had been replaced by plain beige ones. The wooden spoon rest that Albert had made in his high school shop class was gone. Even the small cactus I'd nurtured on the windowsill for 3 years had vanished, leaving only a clean circle on the wood where its pot had sat. "I've been thinking," Mia said as she handed me a cup of the bitter coffee, "about what you said yesterday, about needing time to process everything. And I want you to know that I understand completely. This house holds so many memories for you." She sat across from me at the kitchen table, cradling her own mug with both hands like she was warming them over a fire. The morning light streaming through the window caught the gleam of her wedding ring, and I noticed she was still wearing Albert's ring on a chain around her neck, a touching detail that would look beautiful to any outside observer. "But I've been wondering if staying here might actually make things harder for you," she continued. "All these reminders of Albert, all the places where you can still feel his presence. Sometimes a fresh start can be healing, don't you think?" I studied her face, searching for any crack in the facade, any hint of genuine emotion beneath the performance. Her skin was flawless, professionally maintained, and her makeup was already perfectly applied despite the early hour. Even in grief, even 3 days after burying her husband, she looked like she'd stepped out of a magazine spread about elegant mourning. "This is my home," I said simply. "Of course it is." Her agreement came too quickly, too easily. "And it always will be, in a way. The memories you made here with Albert, the love you shared in this space, no one can take that away from you. But homes are more than just buildings, aren't they? They're about the people who fill them with life and laughter." The implication was clear with Albert gone. The life and laughter had gone too, leaving only an old woman clinging to the past in rooms that no longer belonged to her. "I called a few places yesterday," she continued, pulling a small notebook from her robe pocket, "just to get some information. You understand. There's a lovely senior community about 20 minutes from here, Sunset Gardens. It has a beautiful view of the lake, and they offer so many activities: bridge tournaments, book clubs, gardening groups. I thought you might enjoy the social aspect, being around people your own age who understand what you're going through." My coffee cup rattled against the saucer as I set it down, my hands shaking with rage I was struggling to contain. She'd been planning this conversation, had done research, made calls, probably even visited properties while I was grieving my son. The casual way she mentioned the senior community, as if relocating me was just another item on her to-do list, made my stomach turn. "I'm not ready to think about moving," I managed. "Oh, then, of course not. I didn't mean to suggest. I'm so sorry. Layla, I'm handling this all wrong." She reached across the table and patted my hand, her skin cool and soft against my weathered fingers. "I'm just worried about you, that's all. Albert made me promise to take care of you if anything ever happened to him, and I take that responsibility seriously. Another lie, beautifully crafted and impossible to dispute without seeming ungrateful or paranoid. Albert had never asked her to take care of me. He'd always joked that I was tougher than both of them combined and would probably outlive them all. But Mia was building a narrative, constructing a version of events where her actions seemed motivated by love and duty rather than greed and manipulation. "What about work?" I asked, grasping for some anchor to normalcy. "Shouldn't you be taking time off?" "I am actually bereavement leave." She sipped her coffee delicately. But you're right. Staying busy might help. I've been thinking about making some changes anyway. Albert and I had talked about me maybe going back to school, getting my degree in healthcare administration. He was so supportive of my career goals, more revisionist history. Albert had complained to me just 2 months ago about Mia's expensive, continuing education courses that never seemed to lead anywhere. Her pattern of starting ambitious projects and abandoning them when they required real effort. But now she was painting herself as the ambitious young widow, held back only by her devotion to caring for her elderly mother-in-law. I excused myself and retreated to Albert's office, a small room off the main hallway where he'd kept his computer and important documents. But when I opened the door, I gasped. The space had been completely transformed. Albert's desk, cluttered with receipts and printouts and coffee-stained notebooks, was now pristine. His computer was gone. The bookshelves that had held his collection of military histories and fantasy novels were empty, except for a few decorative objects I didn't recognize. I'm sorry you had to see it like this. Mia appeared behind me, her voice heavy with manufactured sympathy. I know it's shocking. I probably should have warned you, but I couldn't bear to leave it the way it was. It hurt too much. I packed everything carefully, though it's all in the garage with the other things. Other things. My dishes, Albert's books, his computer, his personal papers all relegated to boxes in the garage like items at a yard sale. I turned to face her, and for a moment, her mask slipped. I saw something cold and calculating flash across her features before the concerned widow expression snapped back into place. His desk had all our financial information, I said carefully. Oh, yes, I've been going through all of that. There's so much to handle when someone dies: insurance claims, bank accounts, credit cards. It's overwhelming, really, but I'm managing it. You don't need to worry about any of that business stuff. The dismissive way she said business stuff made my teeth clench. Those were Albert's affairs, his financial records, his investments. As his mother and co-owner of the house, I had every right to know what was happening with his estate, but Mia was treating me like a doddering old woman who couldn't be trusted with complex matters like money and legal documents. That afternoon, while Mia was out running what she called estate errands, I went to the garage, the space that had once held Albert's workbench and fishing gear now looked like a storage unit. Dozens of boxes lined the walls, each labeled in Mia's neat handwriting. Layla's kitchen items, Albert's office files, bedroom linens, books, misc. I opened the box marked Albert's office files with trembling hands. Inside were bank statements, tax returns, insurance policies, but many of the most recent documents were missing: his current bank statements, his investment portfolio, the deed to the house that should have had both our names on it. I dug deeper, growing more frantic, but the most important papers simply weren't there. My hands were shaking as I opened another box, this one labeled Important Documents. Inside were my own papers, my birth certificate, Social Security card, medical records, but also documents I'd never seen before, credit card applications in my name that I hadn't filled out, a pre-approved loan offer that had been partially completed, a form from a debt consolidation company with my information filled in. I sat back on my heels, staring at the papers in my lap. Mia wasn't just trying to get me out of the house. She was setting me up, creating a paper trail that would make me look financially unstable, unable to manage my own affairs. If anyone questioned why I was being forced from my home, She'd have documentation showing that I was drowning in debt, making poor financial decisions, possibly even suffering from age-related cognitive decline. But there was one thing she didn't know. One document she hadn't found because I'd kept it in my bedroom safe all these years. The original deed to the house, the one that clearly showed both Albert's name and mine as co-owners. As long as I had that, she couldn't simply erase me from the property records. At least, I hoped she couldn't. That evening, Mia made dinner something she'd never done in the 2 years she'd lived here. She prepared salmon with roasted vegetables, plated everything beautifully, and even lit candles. It might have seemed like a peace offering if I hadn't spent the day discovering the depth of her deception. "I want to apologize for this morning," she said as we ate. "I realize I've been moving too fast, making decisions without consulting you. It's just that Albert handled so much, and now I feel like I'm drowning in responsibilities." She looked vulnerable in the candlelight, young and overwhelmed, and I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. But then I thought about the forged credit applications hidden in my garage, the missing financial documents, the systematic erasure of my son's presence from his own home. "I'd like to see the house deed," I said quietly. She paused with her fork halfway to her mouth. "The deed. Yes, I want to review our ownership arrangement, make sure I understand my rights and responsibilities." For just a moment, something flickered in her eyes. Panic, maybe, or calculation. Then she smiled sadly. "Oh, Layla, Albert handled all of that. I'm still trying to figure out where he kept everything. But don't worry, I'll make sure you're taken care of, no matter what the paperwork says." No matter what the paperwork says. The phrase sent ice through my veins because it meant she knew exactly what the paperwork said, and she was already planning to ignore it. I smiled back at her, matching her tone of gentle concern. "I'm sure you will, dear. I'm sure you will." But as I helped clear the dinner dishes, my dishes, now relegated to special occasion status, I was already planning my next move. Because if Mia wanted to play games with documents and legal technicalities, she was about to discover that this old woman knew how to fight back. And I was far from helpless. The weight of discovery pressed against my chest like a physical thing as I sat on my bedroom floor at 2 a.m, surrounded by the scattered contents of my personal safe. My hands trembled as I rifled through birth certificates, insurance policies, and old tax returns, searching for the one document that could save me from Mia's calculated cruelty. But the original house deed, the paper that proved my legal right to live in the home I'd helped purchase, was nowhere to be found. I'd checked every folder twice, then 3 times, my panic growing with each fruitless search. The deed had been there 6 months ago when I'd last opened the safe to retrieve my passport for a weekend trip Albert and I had taken to Canada. I remembered seeing it clearly. The official county seal, embossed in blue. Both our names printed in bold black letters under property owners. Now, in its place, was nothing but empty space and the growing certainty that Mia had somehow gained access to my most private documents. My bedroom door was equipped with a simple push-button lock, the kind that could be opened with a bobby pin or thin knife blade, hardly sufficient protection against someone determined to invade my privacy. As I sat there in my nightgown, surrounded by the violated contents of my safe, I realized that Mia's campaign wasn't just about pressuring me to leave. She was systematically stealing the evidence of my legal standing, piece by piece, until I'd have no proof of my rights at all. But I wasn't the helpless old woman she thought I was. 35 years as a nurse had taught me to think clearly under pressure, to document everything, and to never trust anyone completely, especially when lives hung in the balance. And right now, my entire future hung in the balance. The next morning, I waited until I heard Mia's car pull out of the driveway before beginning my own investigation. She'd mentioned having estate errands to run, and I suspected those errands involved more than just filing insurance claims. I started in Albert's office, searching every inch of the room that had once been his sanctuary. The empty bookshelves yielded nothing, but when I ran my hands along the inside edges of his desk drawers, my fingers found something Mia had missed, a small key taped to the underside of the bottom drawer. My heart raced as I recognized it. Albert had shown me this hiding spot years ago, back when he'd first started worrying about identity theft and cybersecurity. It was the key to his safety deposit box at First National Bank, the box where he kept our most important documents for safekeeping. If Mia had found the deed in my bedroom safe, she probably hadn't thought to look for duplicates elsewhere. I dressed quickly and drove to the bank, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles went white. Albert had added my name to the box access list years ago, treating it as another extension of our partnership. The young bank clerk barely glanced at my identification before leading me to the vault, her cheerful small talk about the weather washing over me like background noise. Inside the narrow safety deposit box, I found exactly what I'd hoped for: a manila envelope labeled House Documentation Copy in Albert's careful handwriting. My fingers shook as I opened it, revealing not just a copy of the original deed with both our names clearly listed, but also the refinancing paperwork from last year. According to these documents, when Albert had refinanced the mortgage to get a better interest rate, both our names had remained on the title. More importantly, Mia's name appeared nowhere on any of the paperwork, but there was something else in the envelope that made my blood run cold: a handwritten note from Albert, dated just 3 weeks before his death. My heart hammered as I read his familiar scrawl. "Mom, if you're reading this, something has happened to me, and you probably need these papers. I'm sorry I never told you directly, but Mia has been pressuring me to remove your name from the house title. She says it would be better for our marriage, that we need our own space to grow as a couple. I've been avoiding the conversation because this house belongs to both of us, and I would never do that to you. But I'm worried she might try something if I'm not around to protect your interests. The original deed is in your safe, and this copy is here as backup. Don't let her bully you. This is your home too, and legally, she can't force you out. I love you, and I'm sorry I let things get this complicated. Albert." I pressed the note to my chest, tears streaming down my face as Albert's words from beyond the grave confirmed what I'd suspected all along. Mia hadn't just opportunistically decided to claim the house after his death. She'd been planning this for months, maybe longer. She'd been manipulating my son, poisoning their marriage with demands that he betray his own mother. And when he'd refused to comply, she'd simply waited for fate to give her another opportunity. I made copies of everything at the bank, storing the originals back in the safety deposit box and taking the copies with me. But as I drove home, my initial relief began to give way to a new kind of dread. If Mia had been planning this campaign for months, what else had she prepared? What other surprises was I going to find? I got my answer that afternoon when I returned from the bank to find a locksmith van in my driveway. Through the living room window, I could see Mia directing a uniformed man as he worked on my bedroom door. My stomach dropped as I realized what was happening. She was changing the locks, cutting off my access to my own room under the guise of security improvements. I sat in my car for 10 minutes, forcing myself to breathe slowly and think strategically. Charging into the house and confronting her would only escalate the situation and give her an excuse to paint me as unstable or aggressive. Instead, I needed to be smarter than that. I needed evidence. I pulled out my phone and started recording, narrating quietly as I captured video of the locksmith working on my door. Tuesday, March 15th, 2:30 p.m. I've returned home to find someone changing the locks on my bedroom door without my knowledge or consent. I am a legal co-owner of this property and have lived here for 8 years. The timestamp and my calm, clear voice would provide crucial documentation if this ever went to court. When I finally entered the house, Mia greeted me with her usual performance of concerned sympathy. "Oh, Layla, I was hoping to finish this before you got back. I know it looks dramatic, but I was worried about security. With all the people coming and going for the funeral, and now with Albert's office equipment being so valuable, I thought it would be better to upgrade all the locks in the house." The explanation was reasonable enough to fool a casual observer, but I noticed she avoided mentioning that she was the only one who would have keys to the new locks. My access to my own bedroom was now entirely dependent on her goodwill, a power dynamic she'd engineered deliberately. "That's very thoughtful," I said evenly. "I'll need a key, of course." "Absolutely." She smiled brightly, but I caught the slight hesitation before she responded. "The locksmith is making extra copies right now. I'll get you one as soon as he's finished." But when the locksmith left an hour later, Mia was conveniently occupied with a phone call in the kitchen, and somehow the subject of my key never came up again. That night, I found myself locked out of my own bedroom, forced to sleep on the living room couch like a guest who'd overstayed her welcome. I lay awake on those unfamiliar cushions, staring at the ceiling and listening to the sounds of Mia moving around upstairs. Around midnight, I heard her footsteps on the stairs, then the soft sound of my bedroom door opening and closing. She was in my room, going through my belongings while I was trapped downstairs, unable to protect my privacy or possessions. The next morning brought a new horror. Mia announced over breakfast that she'd scheduled an appointment with an estate attorney. "Just to make sure we're handling everything properly," she explained, buttering her toast with the casual air of someone discussing weekend plans. "Albert's affairs are more complicated than I realized, and I want to make sure we're following all the legal requirements." The way she said "we" made my skin crawl, as if my future were just another item on her administrative to-do list. But what really terrified me was the realization that she was moving forward with legal proceedings based on whatever fraudulent documentation she'd prepared. If she managed to convince an attorney that she was Albert's sole heir and that I was merely a dependent relative with no legal standing, she could have me evicted through official channels. "I think I should be there for that meeting," I said carefully. "Oh, that's so sweet of you to offer, but it's really just boring paperwork stuff, beneficiary forms, tax implications, insurance claims, nothing that would interest you. Besides, you have enough to worry about without getting bogged down in legal technicalities." Another dismissal disguised as consideration. She was planning to meet with an attorney without me present, to present her version of events without any input from the person whose life hung in the balance. I nodded and smiled, pretending to accept her decision while my mind raced through possible countermoves. That afternoon, while Mia was at her mysterious attorney meeting, I conducted my own investigation. I started with Albert's computer, which had mysteriously disappeared from his office, but which I suspected might still be somewhere in the house. I found it in the master bedroom closet, hidden behind a row of Mia's designer coats like contraband. Albert had never been particularly security conscious with his passwords, and I was able to log into his email account using a combination of his birth date and our old address. What I found there made my hands shake with rage and vindication. Dozens of emails between Albert and Mia from the months before his death. Their entire relationship laid bare in digital black and white. The emails revealed the full scope of Mia's manipulation. She'd been pressuring Albert relentlessly about my presence in the house, using emotional blackmail and sexual manipulation to try to force him to choose between his wife and his mother. In one particularly cruel message, she'd written, "I can't build a future with you while your mother controls our lives. Every time I try to make this house feel like our home, she undermines me. It's like living with a ghost from your past who refuses to move on." The Albert's responses showed the agony of a man caught between two women he loved, but also his firm refusal to betray me. My mother isn't controlling our lives. Mia, she's family. This house belongs to both of us legally, and morally, I could never ask her to leave. Can't we find a way to make this work for everyone? But Mia's final email, sent just 2 days before Albert's heart attack, revealed the true depth of her coldness. "Fine. If you won't choose our marriage over your mother, then I'll have to protect my own interests. Don't blame me for what happens next." I stared at that last line until the words burned into my retinas. Mia hadn't just been planning to claim the house after Albert's death, she'd been threatening him, making it clear that she would take action with or without his cooperation. Had the stress of her ultimatum contributed to his heart attack? Had my son died partly because of the impossible situation she'd created? I printed every email, my hands trembling with a mixture of grief and fury. These messages proved that Mia's concern for my well-being was entirely fabricated, that her claims about Albert wanting me to leave were outright lies. More importantly, they established a clear motive for her current behavior. She wasn't acting out of grief or confusion, but executing a plan she'd developed months earlier. But as damning as the emails were, I knew they wouldn't be enough on their own. I needed legal help, someone who could guide me through the process of protecting my rights before Mia's false narrative became legally established. I thought of Harold Winters, the attorney who'd helped Albert and me with our wills several years ago. He was semi-retired now, but he'd always told his clients to call if they ever needed assistance. I used Albert's computer to send Harold an encrypted email, attaching copies of the deed, the bank documents, and the most relevant email exchanges. My message was brief and to the point. "Harold, this is Layla Patterson, Albert's mother. Albert died last week, and his widow is trying to force me from our jointly owned home using fraudulent documents and legal manipulation. I have evidence of her intentions and need guidance on protecting my rights. Can you meet with me tomorrow?" His response came within an hour. "Layla, I'm so sorry for your loss. Yes, I can see you tomorrow at 2 p.m. Bring everything you have. From what you've described, we may need to act quickly to prevent further fraud. Harold." I deleted our email exchange and cleared the browser history, leaving no trace of my communications. But as I prepared to shut down the computer, I noticed something that made my blood run cold, a folder on Albert's desktop labeled New Will Draft. The creation date was 3 days before his death. I opened the folder with shaking hands and found a partially completed will document that bore no resemblance to the real will Albert had filed with Harold years earlier. This version named Mia as the sole beneficiary of Albert's estate and made no mention of me at all. Worse, it contained language specifically stating that any previous arrangements regarding property ownership were null and void. The document was clearly a draft. It lacked proper signatures and notarization, but it represented something far more sinister than simple greed. Mia hadn't just been planning to claim the house. She'd been preparing to forge Albert's will entirely, creating a completely false legal framework to support her theft. I copied the file to a flash drive and deleted it from Albert's computer, but not before noting the metadata that showed Mia's user account as the document's creator. She'd used Albert's computer to draft a fake will in his name, probably planning to have it discovered among his papers after a suitable period of mourning. As I sat there in the dim light of the master bedroom, surrounded by evidence of Mia's calculated deception, I felt something shift inside me. The grief and confusion that had paralyzed me since Albert's death were crystallizing into something much more powerful: cold, focused determination. Mia thought she was dealing with a helpless old woman, someone she could manipulate and intimidate into submission. She'd built her entire strategy around the assumption that I would be too overwhelmed by grief, too intimidated by legal complexities, too isolated and powerless to fight back effectively. She was about to discover just how wrong she was. I had the deed. I had the bank records. I had the emails revealing her true motives. I had evidence of attempted will forgery. And now I had an attorney who understood exactly what kind of predator I was dealing with. Tomorrow, the real battle would begin, and I intended to win. Harold Winter's law office hadn't changed much in the 5 years since Albert and I had last visited to update our wills. The same heavy oak furniture dominated the room, and the same wall of legal books created an atmosphere of solid, unshakable authority. But as I sat across from Harold's mahogany desk, spreading out the evidence I'd gathered like cards in a high-stakes poker game, I felt anything but confident. My hands trembled slightly as I arranged the document's copies of the deed, bank records, Albert's heartbreaking emails, and the draft of the forged will I'd discovered on his computer. Harold had aged since our last meeting, his silver hair now completely white, and his face bearing the deep lines of someone who'd spent decades navigating other people's crises. But his eyes were still sharp, and as he reviewed each document with methodical precision, I could see the attorney's mind working behind his wire-rimmed glasses. "This is quite comprehensive. Layla," he said finally, setting down the last page of email printouts. "I have to say, in 40 years of practice, I've rarely seen such a systematic attempt at property theft disguised as grief counseling." He leaned back in his leather chair, his expression grim. "Your daughter-in-law is either remarkably naive about how property law works, or she's counting on you being too intimidated to fight back." "She's not naive," I said quietly. "She's been planning this for months, maybe longer. Those emails show she was pressuring Albert to remove my name from the deed long before he died." "Yes, I noticed that." Harold picked up Albert's final email to Mia and read it again. "Your son was a good man, Layla. He refused to betray you even when his marriage was at stake. That speaks well of how you raised him." The grief hit me fresh, sharp and unexpected. Albert had died protecting my interests, had literally taken the stress of Mia's ultimatum to his grave rather than hurt me. I pressed a tissue to my eyes, fighting to maintain my composure. "What she's doing, is it legal?" I managed to ask. Harold's expression darkened. "What she's doing is fraud, pure and simple. The forged will draft alone is enough to open a criminal investigation, but the systematic removal of your belongings, the changing of locks, the creation of false financial documents, this goes far beyond a property dispute. This is elder abuse, financial exploitation, and probably several other felonies I could cite if I spent an hour with the criminal code. But can she actually succeed? Can she force me out legally? Not if we act quickly. Harold pulled a legal pad toward him and began making notes. The deed you've provided clearly establishes your ownership rights. The refinancing documents prove those rights were never legally transferred to her. The emails establish her motive and premeditation. And the forged will attempt gives us grounds for criminal charges if we need that leverage. He looked up at me with the expression I remembered from our previous meetings, the look of an attorney who'd found a clear path through a complex legal maze. Here's what we're going to do. First, I'm filing an emergency injunction to prevent any transfer or encumbrance of the property. That will legally freeze the title and stop her from selling or refinancing without your consent. Second, we're requesting a restraining order preventing her from removing any more of your belongings or restricting your access to any part of the house. Third, we're putting the county clerk on notice that any probate documents filed regarding Albert's estate should be flagged for our review. I felt something loosen in my chest for the first time in days. How long will all that take? The paperwork can be filed today. We should have temporary orders in place by tomorrow afternoon. He paused, studying my face. But Layla, you need to understand that this is going to get ugly. Once she realizes you're fighting back with legal representation, she's going to escalate. People like your daughter-in-law don't back down easily when their schemes are exposed. I'm not backing down either, I said, surprising myself with the firmness in my voice. She used my son's death to try to steal my home. She forged his signature and manipulated his emotions. I've been a nurse for 35 years. Harold, I've seen what people are capable of when they think no one is watching. I'm not intimidated by her. Harold smiled for the first time since I'd arrived. Good, because we're going to need that strength. He pulled out a retainer agreement and slid it across the desk. I'm not going to lie to you, this could get expensive if she decides to drag it out. But given the strength of our position and the evidence you've gathered, I think she'll fold once she realizes you're serious about fighting back. I signed the papers without hesitation. The retainer would take a significant chunk out of my savings, but losing the house would cost me everything. As Harold made copies of the documents and prepared the initial filings, I felt a sense of purpose I hadn't experienced since Albert's death. For the first time in over a week, I wasn't just reacting to Mia's attacks. I was taking control of my own fate. One more thing, Harold said as I prepared to leave. Don't let her know about any of this until she's served with the papers. Continue acting as if you're considering her suggestions about moving. Let her think her plan is working. The element of surprise is one of our biggest advantages right now. I drove home with Harold's words echoing in my mind. Playing along with Mia's charade felt distasteful, but I understood the strategic importance of keeping her off balance. She'd built her entire approach around the assumption that I was helpless and isolated. Let her continue believing that until the law came knocking on her door. When I arrived home, Mia was in the kitchen, making what appeared to be a celebration dinner. The table was set with candles, and the good china, my good china, I noticed with irritation, and she was humming as she stirred something fragrant on the stove. Perfect timing, she called out cheerfully. I have wonderful news. I met with the estate attorney today, and everything is much simpler than we thought. Albert's will is very straightforward, and we should be able to settle everything quickly. I forced a smile as I hung up my coat. That's good news. It really is. And I've been thinking about what you said regarding needing time to adjust. I realize I've been pushing too hard, expecting you to make decisions when you're still grieving. She turned to face me, her expression a masterpiece of manufactured concern. So I've made some calls, and I found the perfect solution. There's an assisted living facility about an hour from here, Meadowbrook Manor, and they have a lovely apartment available immediately. My blood turned to ice. An hour away, assisted living. She wasn't just trying to get me out of the house anymore. She was trying to warehouse me somewhere I couldn't cause problems or ask inconvenient questions about Albert's estate. I took the liberty of scheduling a tour for tomorrow, Bud, she continued, apparently oblivious to my horrified silence. I know it seems fast, but these places fill up quickly, and the sooner you get settled, the sooner you can start healing. They have wonderful programs for seniors art therapy, music groups, even pet therapy, and the medical staff is available 24 hours a day, so you'd never have to worry about managing your health alone. The implications were crystal clear. She wasn't just painting me as financially unstable, she was building a case that I was physically and mentally incapable of independent living. The assisted living facility would provide documentation that I required supervised care, making it nearly impossible for me to claim competency to manage property or legal affairs. That's very thoughtful, I managed, my voice sounding strange to my own ears, but I'm not sure I'm ready for such a big change. Of course you're not. Change is scary at any age, but especially when you're dealing with loss. She moved closer, placing a gentle hand on my arm. But Layla, I have to be honest with you. I'm worried about you living alone. Yesterday I found you in Albert's office, just sitting on the floor looking confused. And last week you forgot to turn off the stove after making tea. These things happen as we get older. And there's no shame in admitting we need more support. None of that had happened. The lies flowed from her lips so smoothly, with such apparent sincerity, that I almost doubted my own memory. But I knew she was establishing a narrative, creating incidents that could be cited later as evidence of my declining mental state. I understand your concern, I said carefully, but I think I'd like a second opinion, maybe from my own doctor. Something flickered in her eyes, annoyance, maybe, or calculation. Of course, Dr. Martinez has been your physician for years, hasn't he? I actually called his office today to get your medical records transferred to the new facility. He mentioned some concerns about your blood pressure medication and your, what did he call them? Episodes of confusion. My heart hammered against my ribs. Dr. Martinez had never mentioned any such thing because my blood pressure was fine, and I'd never experienced episodes of confusion. Mia was either lying outright or had somehow convinced my doctor that I was displaying symptoms I'd never actually shown. Maybe I should call his office myself, I suggested. Oh, you don't need to worry about that. I've been handling all the medical coordination. It's one less thing for you to stress about. She smiled brightly, but I caught the steel beneath the sweetness. Why don't you just focus on getting emotionally ready for this transition? I know it's a lot to process. That night, I lay on the living room couch, still locked out of my own bedroom, and stared at the ceiling while Mia's voice drifted down from upstairs. She was on the phone again, her tone businesslike and confident. Yes, the apartment is perfect. No, she doesn't suspect anything. The medical documentation should be sufficient. See, it's handled. I closed my eyes and forced myself to breathe slowly. Tomorrow. Harold's papers would be filed. Tomorrow. The law would step in to protect my rights. Tomorrow. Mia would discover that the helpless old woman she'd been manipulating had teeth. But tonight, I had to endure one more performance, One more evening of pretending to be the confused, grateful dependent she needed me to be. I thought about Albert's final email, about his refusal to betray me even when his marriage hung in the balance. He died protecting my interests, and I owed it to his memory to see this fight through to the end. The sound of Mia's footsteps on the stairs interrupted my thoughts. I closed my eyes and regulated my breathing, feigning sleep. She paused at the bottom of the stairs, and I could feel her watching me in the darkness. After a long moment, she moved toward the kitchen, and I heard the soft sound of papers rustling. When I was certain she'd gone back upstairs, I crept to the kitchen and peered around the corner. On the counter was a manila folder labeled Meadowbrook Manor, Admission Papers. Beside it was another folder marked Medical Evaluation, L. Patterson. My hands shook as I carefully opened the medical folder. Inside were forms purporting to be from Dr. Martinez's office, documenting a pattern of cognitive decline, memory loss, and confusion that had supposedly been developing over the past 6 months. The signature looked authentic, but the dates and symptoms were completely fabricated. Mia hadn't just been planning to steal my house. She'd been methodically building a case for having me declared incompetent. The assisted living facility wasn't a temporary solution. It was meant to be permanent. Once I was safely warehoused an hour away from anyone who knew me, she could complete her theft of Albert's estate without interference. I photographed every document with my phone, then carefully returned everything to its original position. As I crept back to the couch, my mind raced with the implications of what I'd discovered. This wasn't just fraud anymore. This was a conspiracy to have me committed based on false medical evidence. But Harold had been right about one thing. Mia had underestimated me. She'd assumed I would be too intimidated, too confused, too isolated to fight back effectively. She'd built her entire scheme around the stereotypical image of a helpless elderly woman who could be easily manipulated and discarded. Tomorrow, she was going to learn just how wrong she was about that. As I finally drifted off to sleep on the uncomfortable couch cushions, my last conscious thought was of Albert's voice, the way he used to call me his tough old bird whenever I faced down a difficult situation. "You're stronger than you know, Mom," he'd always said. "Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Yeah, I wasn't going to let anyone tell me otherwise ever again. The process server arrived at exactly 2:47 p.m. on a gray Thursday afternoon, just as Mia was loading suitcases into her car for what she'd told me was a weekend retreat to clear my head. I watched from the living room window as the uniformed man approached her with a thick manila envelope, his voice carrying clearly across the quiet suburban street. "Mia Patterson, you're being served with an emergency injunction and restraining order." The color drained from her face as she opened the envelope, her hands trembling as she scanned Harold's meticulously prepared legal documents. I saw the exact moment she realized her scheme had crumbled. Her shoulders sagged, her mouth fell open, and she looked toward the house with something approaching panic in her eyes. When our gazes met through the window, I simply nodded once, letting her know that the helpless old woman she'd been manipulating was gone forever. Within 48 hours, Harold's legal strategy had dismantled every aspect of Mia's fraud. The forged medical records fell apart under scrutiny when Dr. Martinez confirmed he'd never written any reports about cognitive decline. The fake will was exposed through digital forensics that traced its creation directly to Mia's computer. Most damning of all, the emails I'd discovered provided clear evidence of premeditation and motive, faced with the possibility of criminal charges for elder abuse, financial fraud, and attempted forgery. Mia's attorney advised her to accept a settlement that would allow her to leave quietly in exchange for dropping the criminal case. She was gone by the following weekend, taking only her personal belongings and leaving behind the house that had never legally belonged to her anyway. I spent my first night alone in the house since Albert's death, sitting in his favorite chair, holding the handwritten letter he'd left me. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It was peaceful, filled with the quiet satisfaction of a battle won and a home reclaimed. Sometimes life throws us into battles we never asked for, especially when we're at our most vulnerable. Mia thought she could prey on an elderly woman in grief, assuming I'd be too overwhelmed to fight back. But here's what I learned. Your worth isn't determined by your age, your circumstances, or other people's assumptions about what you can handle. The most powerful weapon against manipulation isn't anger or confrontation. It's preparation, documentation, and quiet determination. Every email I saved, every photo I took, every conversation I recorded became a piece of evidence that ultimately saved my home. When people try to gaslight you or rewrite your reality, having proof of the truth becomes your lifeline. But more than that, I learned that grief doesn't make you weak. It can make you fierce. Albert's love gave me strength even after he was gone, reminding me that some things are worth fighting for, no matter how impossible the odds seem. To everyone watching this, what's one moment when you had to stand up for yourself against impossible odds? Share your story in the comments below. Your experience might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. And if this story resonated with you, please subscribe and hit that notification bell. We're building a community of people who refuse to be underestimated, and your voice matters here. Remember, you're stronger than you know, and you're never too old to fight for what's rightfully yours.